right? So I'm failing to see what the symmetry breaker is supposed to be in terms of, the promotion of democracy between the system that I'm advocating for and the system that you're advocating for.
Well, because in the system that exists now, if you don't like something, you don't buy it. That's the first thing. So there is a
True.
direct control over the markets in that sense. And then as far as democracy,
Wait, but
I
that's
think
not
one
a
of the
symmetry, right?
I think in terms of a governing system, I think what the founders of this country recognized is that throughout human history, people have been trying to deal with corruption, and they found that the separation of powers was the best way to deal with that. They understood that there will always be corruption in any system, but that they can at least try to minimize it. I mean, yeah, Norway has this system, but communism or socialism or Marxism as its overriding principle has failed numerous times and cost hundreds of millions of lives, and have those systems have collapsed unless propped up by dictatorships. And how many times are we going to try and reinvent the wheel
Yeah.
and think that we can do it better?
Hey, can I ask a question, Nathan? To Alan.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do you reconcile the founders' ideas with the fact that they established a government service like the post office?
I don't know what you mean by that. But
Sorry,
I mean,
I'm asking Alan because
oh, I see.
you see what I mean? Yeah.
Yes, that's called capitalism.
The
Well,
post
no, I
office
mean
is
it's
Do
capitalism.
you,
state-owned.
do
I
you,
mean, it's
do
more
you,
directly controlled.
yeah,
The post office is more directly controlled by the state than any of the companies that would be owned by a social wealth fund.
yeah, and
Right?
the
But anyways,
fact that the
but
post office exists doesn't suddenly mean that it's socialism or communism.
okay. Well,
I
That's a fair
mean that,
point.
yeah.
I mean to get back to your earlier points. So you'd mentioned I'm sorry. So you mentioned I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, you mentioned that like the people in a current sort of capitalist economy um have the ability to control companies through through buying things, basically this sort of idea that you vote with your dollars or whatever when you're at the grocery store or whatever. And I mean, that's kind of true, but I take it that, well, for one, that's not at all a symmetry breaker between the system that I'm advocating for and the system that you're advocating for. Because, like I said, I mean, the system that I'm advocating for would involve the same market mechanisms as the society that you're advocating for. It would just the ownership structure would operate differently. And so that's one point. Another point is I take it that the sort of package of things that people are voting for when they're at the grocery store aren't the kinds of things that socialists complain about people not being able to vote on, right? So, for example, socialists might complain that people aren't able to vote on the sort of internal operations of businesses and, what kinds of conditions they treat their workers with, what the pay scales look like, whether or not those kinds of businesses promote long-term value or short-term value, or whether they do things that are harmful to the environment or whatever. And I mean, I just take it that it's fairly clear that when people are quote unquote voting for with their dollars at the grocery store, I mean, those aren't the kinds of things that people are voting on, right? People are voting on which kind of cereal will my kids find tasty and that sort of thing. And so I don't think the kinds of voting that occurs at the grocery store has any sort of equivalence to the much more robust kind of democracy that people would have over corporations in the system that I'm advocating for, where the people through their elected representatives would actually be able to sort of directly control and guide the sort of internal operations of businesses. And then one final point is that insofar as capitalism is good because it allows you to vote with your dollars, um, it's not going to be a very effective democracy when some people have like a million times more votes than other people. And that's the kind of situation that you get under capitalism, where some people get way more dollar votes than other people because they get way more money. Whereas the system that I'm advocating for would sort of compress income levels. And so by your own standards would sort of bring people's varying amounts of votes into closer alignment, bringing it, making the system much more authentically democratic, I would say.
Well,
Can you
people
offer
hate
just
It would face a
compressed.
lot of resistance, is what I'm thinking, from the people who currently benefit right now.
Yeah,
That's for
people
sure.
hate compressed income levels. They absolutely hate it.
Wait, who?
Yeah,
It's not fair, right?
ask in any communist country, and you'll see. And the
Well, I
kind of
mean,
corruption it breeds, and
we don't.
inefficiency that it breeds, is
So,
astronomical. The
so there's
second
two.
point is that as far as the internal workings of a company, that's between the employers and the employees. That's not the concern of the consumer. And the whole idea that companies or capitalism is somehow inherently evil is actually false. Capitalism and people who create companies create opportunities and create wealth and advance the standard of living, advance leisure time, advance so many aspects of our society. But then for the government to step in between the employers and employees and say, well, you can only pay this much, you can only make this much, is ridiculous, because at their core, people work to make money. That includes the people who take the greatest risk. That is the people who found companies. They do it
Yeah.
for the money.
Okay.
Everyone does it for the money. And the problem with socialism is that it rejects that idea and tries to impose this utopian ideal where everybody just helps everybody else out through the goodness of their heart. And while that might be a nice idea, it doesn't actually exist.
Okay. So, I think
It's not
that
fair.
sort of two of the. Oh, sorry. Wait. Okay. Maybe you guys can hear me better now. I said my connection was poor. So, okay. So I think two of the comments that you made sort of made the same mistake. So one, you said that um, under socialism or under a sort of system where you basically highly compress income levels compared to where they're at right now, you'd get a lot of corruption. And then another point that you made is that, socialism relies on this sort of utopian, unrealistic vision of human nature where everybody is sort of altruistic and singing kumbaya with one another and so on. Whereas, obviously that's not the reality. That's not what people are like. And so socialism has this unrealistic vision of human nature that's overly optimistic. And I think that both of those statements sort of get the order of operations completely backwards, which is just to say that the more you think that people are brutal and unaltruistic and psychopathic and self-serving and egoistic or whatever you want to say, um, the more you have that sort of a view about human nature and the more you're concerned about a tendency towards corruption, the more you should be focused on making it the case that some people don't have dramatically higher amounts of power and influence than other people, right? Because if we have a situation where some people have way more money and therefore way more power and more influence than other people, then that means that those people with more money and more power have carte blanche to essentially exploit the people who have less money, and make those people work towards their own interests. And because I am skeptical of the idea that people are inherently altruistic, I think we should be striving to limit the ability to which some people can exploit other people. And that means trying to compress income levels, because high levels of income inequality create high levels of inequality in terms of power. And that creates the situation I was just talking about and trying to avoid. And then you'd mentioned that basically, capitalists should be compensated because capitalists, they create companies and they create opportunities and they have all these great ideas. And the mistake that you're making there is that you're conflating the category of capitalists with the category of entrepreneurs. And those are two distinct categories, right? I mean, there's a lot of capitalists who aren't entrepreneurs, right? And there are a lot of entrepreneurs who aren't necessarily capitalists. I mean, they're just two distinct categories, right? People who own capital don't have to create a business, right? And anybody who, has like a 401k or something knows this, right? You have money and it's in a fund and you leave it in there and you gain more money over time, and you didn't do anything, right? You didn't have any ideas to generate that money. You just sat there and your money increased, right? If you have, say, money in an index fund or something. And that's just how it works, right? And so you're gaining capital income and you're not really doing anything for it. And that's how a lot of people gain their capital income. So to conflate the category of people who own capital and make significant amounts of money from it with the category of people who have these ideas and create new businesses, I don't think that's legitimate.
Well, you're making a distinction that doesn't matter. And the fact that someone takes their money and sinks it into a 401k or some other kind of market account or makes investments, they're taking money that they earned and they are giving that money. It's not just some magical fund. That money is then taken and used by other companies to generate products and services and to create more income and to employ more people. So it's the money just doesn't magically gain. Even if you take it to a bank, you give the bank $100,000, by law, it loans out, I forget what the percentage is, but it loans out 80 or 90% of your money to someone else to buy a home. I mean, the typical model was a savings and loan. It then takes your money that you're saving, loan it out to someone else so they can buy a home, gets paid 5% interest and pays you 2% interest. And that's
Yeah, I mean,
how money, but if but entrepreneurs can be capitalists and capitalists can be entrepreneurs. But the other issue is when I say, well, it breeds inefficiency, I'm not talking theoretically, I'm talking historical fact. And that when you look at communist societies such as the Soviet Union, and I know many people who grew up, including my wife, who grew up under Soviet rule, and you look at the way those companies, the products were made and industry was run in those countries. It was highly inefficient and highly susceptible to the corruption you're concerned about, and highly susceptible to the power concerns you have as well. There was the imbalance of power that you're so concerned with was worse under Soviet rule, because under Soviet rule, the party leaders amongst themselves decided who was going to be in power, either by political maneuvering or assassinations, and that the people had zero influence. So
Yeah.
I don't know. You've got this idealistic view of Marxism or socialism or communism, whatever you want to call it, and it's very nice and it's pretty, but again, I will say, and I don't say this in in a negative way, that people want to earn their money and keep everything they own. People are generous when they are not forced to be generous. And that's shown in various psychological studies. And even in there have been times where in politics and in the history of this country where people have been forced to do something because they were told it was for the greater good, and the amount of pushback they got because they were forced against their wills had negative effects. So I'm this is not the first conversation I've had about this subject,
Yeah.
and
So
it's just it's you've got a belief and an ideology, but it just just does not jive with anything related to the real world.
yeah. So
Yeah,
I mean,
like Ethan, I feel that same way, right? I want socialism, don't get me wrong. I can see why I would want it. You know, I don't want to work my whole life. I don't want to keep investing into a 401k. I don't want to save up enough money to buy a house. I don't want to feel like I'm risking my entire life when I open a business. I don't want those things. I don't want those things for my customers. I'm a business consultant. However, I mean, socialism doesn't seem so fair. It seems really unfair, and it feels very not free. And now just imagine, right? Like imagine a world where like you're really not free. And I think like you have, like you've definitely thought about this a lot. But like a world where you're not free, and I'm using broad and general terms because like I don't want to get into the specifics, then I'd be talking forever. But it just generally like I'm a person that likes expensive hobbies. I bought a Mercedes and I love it, and I'm gonna buy a home. I don't think that would have been possible with socialism. You know what I mean? And like the technology that we're using, I don't think we would have gotten to this point without capitalism. And it sucks because capitalism is like fucking cutthroat. So I see your point, but I still think that's why not socialism.
yeah. So I'll respond to both points in order. So I mean, the first guy, Alan, you had basically mentioned your objection to socialism was um, basically just a historical, as a matter of fact, when we look at, historical attempts at achieving socialism, for example, in the Soviet Union, it led to immense, inefficiency and corruption and all kinds of bad outcomes. And we don't want that, so we shouldn't want socialism. And I mean, I agree that, okay, so I would just say that broadly speaking, socialism is a sort of very broad concept that sort of encompasses a lot of different models and institutions and historical examples and different policies. And some of the various models or institutions associated with socialism have failed miserably when they've been attempted. But that's not dissimilar to, you know, obviously we know that as a matter of historical fact, early capitalist experiments repeatedly failed miserably as capitalism emerged initially out of feudalism, which was its sort of economic predecessor. Um, but, and I agree that we should learn from these failures, these historical failures of socialism, and that socialists should guide our model of socialism away from what's been shown to fail historically and towards what's been shown to be successful so as to not emulate the failures that we've seen. Um, And I think that the elements which are crucial to the model of socialism that I've explicated today, so things like social wealth funds, nationalizations of certain industry, big sectoral unions, redistribution, etc. I mean, I think that these have all been demonstrably successfully beta tested numerous times under capitalism. And so I don't think there's any robust empirical inductive case against the particular model of socialism that I'm advocating for. Now, there is a strong historical argument against people who want to replicate the Soviet Union, but that's not what I'm doing. And so that's just going to be immaterial to my position to, pointing out the failures of the Soviet Union. Um, and I would also say that, I mean, if you want to look towards countries which come closest to emulating my sort of provisional socialist utopia, then we might want to look to countries like Norway, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, countries which, far from being the sort of disasters on par with the Soviet Union, these countries tend to be pretty successful on a variety of metrics, from economic growth to poverty to inequality to happiness to social progressiveness indexes, whatever we want to look at, these countries are pretty successful. And then the other, Adam, you had mentioned that you think that socialism is unfree, and it seemed like your main defense for that claim was this idea that, well, under capitalism, you can live these sorts of extravagant lifestyles if you want to. You can own a Mercedes and have these sort of expensive hobbies. Whereas under socialism, you're not quite sure if these things would be possible. I mean, if we're going to say that, if we're going to say that what you're talking about is just like Mercedes, then I'm not sure that it would be impossible to have that level of uh, income in a socialist society, such that you can own something like a Mercedes or whatever. It doesn't seem to me that inequality would be shrunk to such a degree that you wouldn't be able to do something like that in the kind of system that I'm advocating for. But I mean, more broadly, to get more to the core of the point, I would say that, yeah, some people's freedom would have to be restricted to achieve socialism, particularly the freedom of the people who are currently very rich under our existing economic system. So, like, certainly Jeff Bezos's freedom to, have 5 different yachts or whatever would be restricted under the kind of socialist economy that I'm advocating for. But that only looks at one side of the equation. Because if you look at the other side, which is that in our current economic model, we have millions of people who don't even have the freedom to access healthcare when they need it, right? Or to work in a business where they're not being lorded over by a capitalist who controls when they get to use the bathroom, which leads to scenarios like, Amazon workers peeing in bottles all the time and so on, because of the, destitution of their situation. Then I think, freedom on the net, considering that side of the equation, would clearly be increased under the kind of socialism that I'm advocating for, which is just to say that I think that people's freedom to live with their basic needs being met and not having the majority of time in their life being sort of controlled by, sort of petty tyrant called a boss at the place they work at. Um, I think that those kinds of freedoms are much more substantial than the freedoms of people like, Jeff Bezos to have way more stuff than other people do and have these sorts of extravagant lifestyles.
To a certain degree, I agree with you because, like there's no reason for someone to have nearly $100 billion. Okay, so I get it. I get it. Like that makes some sort of sense, and I always think that way too. But like just the freedom to go out and start a business and kind of have rule over how it's gonna work. I mean, I see what you're saying when it comes to like some people not having access to health insurance. I think right now, as we speak in 2022, there are some really socialist you know, at least there's some socialism going on in the lower tier of people that, you know, can't afford certain things. Like, you know, we have programs like food stamps, we have programs like you know, WIC, and folks that, you know, that are on unemployment. So, you know, it's still there, you know, disabilities, Social Security, it's still there for those people. Um, but I also think, like, because of capitalism, like, we're able to, I mean, look at us, we're discussing something on an application called Clubhouse that's, you know, over Wi-Fi, and without the freedom to create, and without someone taking a massive risk with their capital, it we wouldn't have gotten this far so fast. And so I think it's catapulting our world that we live in. I mean, there's examples if you want them, and I'm sure you understand them. You sound very bright. All around the world. Just look at more socialist countries, and look how far they've gotten, and then kind of compare that to the US.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, so I guess what I would say um, is that, so you mentioned that you think it's important to have sort of the freedom to start businesses. Um, and I
Yeah.
think, you know, to some degree that's true. And I think that the sort of model of socialism that I've explicated, although I don't think I went too in depth while you were here, um, sort of allows for that to some degree, which is, I mean, we could imagine sort of a socialist system where you can start a business, and you get full ownership of it for a while, and then maybe it could work in a similar way to how, you know, like the patent system, the currently existing patent in the United States, which is just you get some amount of ownership for a while, and then gradually over time that ownership decreases until eventually, you know, the thing that you've created is just fully publicly owned. And then in addition to that, we might imagine that during the process of taking the business away from the person who created it, the government would obviously, you know, not just take it away simpliciter, but it would actually, you know, buy it out and, you know, give a large monetary reward to the person who created it. And if the person who created it wants, they could even still be like a head of the company. Like maybe they could be a CEO or sit on some high level managerial position or something, so long as they're doing a good job and abiding by the sort of social goals that the Social Wealth Fund is set out to protect and promote in its ownership of businesses. And so you could still have some degree of entrepreneurship in the kind of economy that I'm advocating for. Certainly, though, I don't want to be misleading, because I mean, it would definitely be the case that the people who create businesses would have less rights over their businesses than they currently do. And so that's a freedom that would be restricted, right? The freedom of the entrepreneur to sort of do whatever they want with their company, um, and own it for as long as they want, and so on, would be definitely reduced under the kind of system that I'm advocating for. But I mean, again, by the same token, I would just say that, you know, on the other side of the equation, we have all these people in the current system who, because we allow capitalists so much freedom over their companies, we have, you know, all of these people in society who are essentially have no control over these institutions that dramatically impact their lives, which is to say workers at a company, as well as, you know, the people who live in the society that a company operates in. Their lives are going to be massively shaped by the decisions of the company in question. And it seems sort of unfair, unfree, and anti-democratic that people's lives can be massively shaped by decisions that they had no part in making, or that they were excluded from participating in. And so I think that's a much more substantial form of freedom that would be increased in the kind of socialist society that I advocate for. And that's well worth the price of reducing the freedom of capitalists to just do whatever they want with the business that they've created for however long they want. Um, and then, you also had mentioned that, without capitalists, we wouldn't have, Clubhouse or, all of these sorts of interesting inventions. And so this is an interesting point because it seems like you're kind of talking about the incentive to innovate and the incentive to create sort of novel ideas and businesses and so on. And that maybe that would be reduced under socialism. And so I would say a couple of things. One is that, so people have this model, and it seems like that's the sort of model that you're invoking, and that a lot of sort of capitalist apologists invoke, which is that, we basically want it to be this lottery-like system where we have a bunch of people who are sort of poor or lower class or maybe even middle class, and they're all sort of, anybody who creates a business, they know that the chance is going to be overwhelmingly that their business ends up failing. But I suppose the idea is that if you make the potential payout big enough, right, like if you have an economy that just allows for immense amount of inequality, such that if you do create this really successful business, you get this enormous payout, then that will be enough to really sort of get people to want to, all run towards making the business, even though they know it's not likely going to succeed. And then, like, another model might just be that people will be more likely to create businesses when we give them more, like, sort of flexibility in their lives and more of an ability to create businesses without taking on these enormous costs. And so what I mean by that is, take, for example, somebody in the US economy who doesn't have health care. Or maybe, no, they do have healthcare, right? But it's just tied to like their current job or something like that, right? And so they're thinking of, I have this idea for a business. I want to maybe start up a business. But if I leave my job to start up a business and then the business fails, I will no longer have healthcare, right? Or, it doesn't even have to be that dramatic. It can just be, I'm earning a wage from my current job. And if I leave my job and I start a business and then that business fails, then I'll be much poorer. And so there's this really big risk associated with starting a business when levels of inequality are high, because there's a lot of distance below you that you can fall if the business fails. And so in a socialist economy, basically you would have much less inequality, and your basic needs would basically be taken care of regardless of whether you're currently working or not, whether you're able to find a job or not. And so there's just much less risk involved with starting a business, because even if the business fails, your basic needs are still going to be taken care of. You're not going to be in that much worse of a position than you currently are, and so on. And so on that side of the equation, we would expect or a socialist economy, by lowering inequality, to maybe increase the amounts of entrepreneurship or the sort of incentive to innovate. And which mechanism is going to be more powerful, right, when it comes to incentivizing business startups? Whether it's more powerful to give people more flexibility and less risk involved in creating a business, or whether it's more powerful to just make this sort of lottery type payout really huge. That seems like, at best, an open empirical question. It's not obvious to me which side would be more effective at encouraging innovation, I guess.
I, you see it kind of, sort of, just barely working in Cuba right now, and that's a much smaller sample size. So, it'd be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And I think that, what you see as an empirical note, if we want to look at individual countries, if you look to, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, these are countries with very high levels of economic equality. And they also happen to have very high rates of innovation, right? Some of the highest in the world, which seems to bode positively for the kind of story that I'm telling, which is that, if you give people more flexibility and there's less risk involved in having new ideas and creating new companies, that's going to promote innovation and business development, at least enough to offset whatever losses you see in terms of, well, now you don't have as much to gain if your business succeeds.
We're not that far behind Sweden. We're pretty dang close when it comes to innovation and like kind of like the latest global rankings.
Yeah, that's true. No, you're right. I mean, it's not like Sweden is just like massively outpacing us in terms of innovation or something. I guess my point is just, it's not necessary for me that socialism is going to increase innovation, because I think socialism is sort of independently motivated in a variety of ways, which is just to say that, socialism will increase equality, which is inherently good. It'll increase the amount of democracy that we have. I think it'll increase people's freedom, at least over their own workplaces, which is really good, because I like, freedom, democracy, equality, all these kinds of things. And so I think socialism is independently motivated. And then if somebody responds, well, okay, maybe socialism has those benefits, but it has this cost, which is even greater, which is that it's going to lower innovation. And the mechanism through which it would lower innovation is by making it such that you don't have as much to gain by creating a successful company. And I would just respond to that by saying, yeah, but plausible theoretical speculation as well as empirical observation seems to bear out the claim that you also get an increased promotion of innovation, in the sense that now, or owing to the fact that now in a socialist economy, people have less to lose if in attempting to create a socialist, or in attempting to create a new business. And if that's enough to sort of cancel out the detriments to innovation that occur as a result of the mechanism that you're talking about, and then the innovation point ends up being a wash, right? So like the innovation consideration doesn't favor one side over the other, then it seems like, I have no reason to think that socialism has some cost that outweighs the benefits that I've been talking about.
Yeah, no, that's certainly interesting.
Yeah. I'll see if this other person wants to come on and speak. If not, it's pretty late, so I may just go to bed.
Yeah, that was my next move too.
But thanks for talking to me. I've appreciated the
Yeah,
conversation.
for sure.